Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. Two impressive wins on the road for Norwich City against Watford and Portsmouth, but they're back in front of their own fans this weekend when Middlesbrough travel to Carrow Road, where Norwich will be desperate to get a first home win of the season. You know the drill here on Tactics Board. First of all, I'll take you through the 11 that I think Liam Manning will choose for the game. Then we'll take a look at Middlesbrough, who actually have had a really good start to the season. We'll look at tactically how they set up, how it might pan out against Norwich and the way that each team plays and how tactically the game might look. Then we're going to come on to this week, sort of the attacking side of things. And I don't want to say Norwich have had offensive issues. Of course, they've scored 5 goals in their first 3 games, 2 in each of their last 2 games. But I think Manning's being quite open about the fact that he wants his teams to dominate possession a little bit more, to dominate the game on the ball and maybe be a little bit more consistent in terms of their chance creation and how much time they spend in the final third and in the opposition half. So I'm going to take a little bit of a closer look at how they can do that, how they can pen opposition teams in, and ultimately how they can create better chances from open play. But we'll come on to that. First of all, it's the starting 11. So without further ado, here's the team I think Manning will choose for tomorrow's game. So I've gone for Vladan Kovacevic in goal for Norwich with a back three of Jakov Medic, Harry Darling and Jose Cordoba, with Jack Stacey at right wing back, Papa Amadou Diallo at kind of left wing back, also in maybe sort of more of a left wing position. In midfield, I've got Mirko Topic and Jacob Wright, with Emiliano Marcondes and Ante Cianats slightly behind Josh Sargent in a sort of front three. Now, you'll notice I've only made one change from that win over Portsmouth. I think after you get such an impressive victory, and although there were maybe some tactical issues that we'll go over, ultimately it was the sort of win that I think Manning will be absolutely delighted with. He certainly was post-match, and I'm sure the atmosphere in that dressing room after they managed to get those 3 points over the line was absolutely buzzing. Particularly in the first half, they were very good, both in and out of possession. And I think you look at the tactical balance present in that game, and there's not much there that Manning is going to want to mess with. Yes, it's a home game, but I don't think we'll see complete change from that Portsmouth game. I think there is probably more onus on Norwich to kind of control things and maybe to play slightly nicer football in quotation marks. But Middlesbrough are a really good side, as they've proven. They can also do it on the ball rather than just sort of defensively, as maybe Rob Edwards' football has typically been defined or associated with. So Norwich will still need to be quite solid, but also they addressed some of the attacking issues to an extent. And though I think Manning will want to make some changes to things on the training pitch, and there'll be things that they've been working on that probably we'll come on to later where they can improve on things in possession, I think on the whole he'll want to see similar themes to what we saw against Portsmouth, and that means I don't think he'll make too many changes to the team, both for that reason and also because of sort of rhythm, and you don't want to upset that rhythm too much when the team's got a couple of wins on the bounce, the feeling's good behind the scenes, and there's a bit of momentum there. So I've only gone for the one change. It is an enforced one in midfield. Marcelino Nunez, obviously out injured with an ankle issue that Manning said in his pre-match press conference would keep him out for weeks rather than months. And although that's probably largely good news at this stage of the season, of course an international break coming up quite soon, the games aren't that regular at this stage of the season, sort of early on, so there definitely are worse times where it could have happened to Norwich. But I think after Nunez got a goal against Watford, an assist to help Harry Darling open the scoring against Portsmouth, it is still quite poor timing, especially when he obviously didn't start the season in that midfield too. It was Topic and Wright, and it looked like he had started to really show Manning what he was worth and how valuable he could be. I also felt like he helped link things in that attacking sense a little bit more as well, and maybe you don't get as much of that from Topic and Wright. But all of that said, I think Topic and Wright is still a very, very solid championship midfield. It might be that one or both of them needs to be a little bit more attacking than traditionally they would be, because Topic is obviously more of a defensive midfielder. Wright is somebody who maybe is somebody you'd associate with being on the ball more, but that's not really in an advanced position. He's more of a tempo controller who will get on the ball quite deep and spread it wide and kind of keep things ticking in the midfield rather than pushing on and creating chances, scoring goals, adding a bit of flair like Marcelino Nunez would. And I'm sure Manning will have some other things up his sleeve attack-wise, and of course we will come on to that, but probably those midfield, that midfield too needs to be a little bit more creative and maybe push themselves in an attacking sense a little bit more just to make up for the loss of Nunez. But certainly nothing wrong with that midfield. Obviously they'll have Kenny McLean coming in very soon when he returns from an ankle injury as well. So it does feel like that department is going to be bolstered to make up for Nunez's injury quite soon. They definitely could be in a worse position. But I just think there are a couple of things that you lose from Nunez that maybe you don't have with Wright and Topic that Norwich will need to look out for and probably find solutions for elsewhere. That said, defensively, it probably works quite well for them making that change because, for all of Nunez's positives, and he certainly covers his fair share of the ground, you wouldn't say that physically he's as much of a presence as really any of the other midfielders Norwich have. Obviously, Topic, Wright, McLean, even the likes of Liam Gibbs probably offer a little bit more physically. So maybe Norwich will gain in that sense, and against a team that's quite good in there, also plays with a midfield too, and it will be a bit of a physical battle to gain control of the engine room. Perhaps that's no bad thing, but I do think there are in possession problems that Norwich will have to cover for that maybe they didn't have to deal with when Nunez was in there. You'll notice from the graphic I've just shown on the screen, I've got it as a sort of 3-4-3. I'd say that Diallo is maybe the one main change from that. Certainly against Portsmouth, he really was playing as an out-and-out winger. But what I've noticed from this sort of hybrid system that Manning's been using, where sometimes Norwich look like a 3, sometimes they look like a 5, sometimes they look like they're in almost a 4-4-2, is that the more possession Norwich have and the more control they have, the higher up the pitch they are, that's when they look most like a sort of 3-4-3 with wing-backs. That's when Ante Seaman principally is able to get into a number 10 position rather than being a sort of right midfielder. And a lot of the time when against Portsmouth, Norwich didn't have control of the ball, it actually looked like Seaman was a proper right midfielder in a 4 in midfield with Jack Stacey behind him. Emi Marcondes looked more like the number 10, but just a more traditional one behind Sargent. You didn't have that front 3, and maybe that's where that chance creation or the lack thereof came from. Seaman, I don't think, had a great game and wasn't able to really impact things too much. So I think in those games where Norwich have more possession, they dominate things a little bit more, that's when it tends to look more like a 3-4-3. And given the fact that they're at home and probably Middlesbrough will be happy at times to go a little bit more defensive, you'd like to think that Norwich will control things more, and maybe then as a result it will look a bit more like that 3-4-3. So that's what I've gone for, but again, you'd expect it to rotate. Sometimes it will look like a 4-4-2, sometimes it will look like a 5-2-3 or a 5-3-2, and we know things are very fluid in modern football, but particularly in this Liam Manning system. So plenty to look out for team news-wise, but I'm not expecting loads of changes from the Norwich end. On to Middlesbrough then, and a really interesting side when you look at how things were going for them in pre-season. I think outside the Middlesbrough bubble, there was mostly shock that they'd sacked Michael Carrick, who I think had impressed most people last season, playing some pretty good football, part of that sort of younger generation of manager, and seemed to be taking them in the right direction, but obviously quite a poor end to the season for them last season. They didn't end up really getting close to qualifying for the Championship playoffs, which probably most people would say they should be in and around and would expect them to be in and around this season. They replaced Carrick with Rob Edwards, which stylistically feels like quite a big change, but certainly you look at his achievements, certainly before last season at Luton, and it kind of makes sense. And actually, their start to the season really backs that up. They've won both of their games. They haven't conceded a goal yet, not in the Championship. Beat Swansea 1-0 at home in the first game of the season. Then got a fantastic 3-0 away win against Millwall, which I would say probably very few, if any, teams will replicate at the Den this season. And in that one, I think you could look at it, you could look at the fact that they haven't conceded a goal yet and say, okay, look at Rob Edwards' Luton team. They were quite physical, they were quite defensive at times. It was quite Route 1. And although there are elements of that to Middlesbrough's play at the moment, particularly that second half against Millwall, displayed the fact that that isn't the only way they're going to play. They actually had more possession than Millwall did. They created more chances. They dominated the game on the ball, really. And in that second half, they looked really, really good. They looked potent. I suppose you look at that squad and it's not really any shock that they have got the players to do that. But system-wise, Edwards has made some slight tweaks to what maybe he's done previously at Luton when he's been the underdog and earlier in his career at Forest Green. But there are some themes that have carried through, and one of them is the importance of the wing-backs, how big they are for Middlesbrough. They've been a key outlet for them and a sort of a big threat for them going forward, really. So that's something that Norwich certainly need to watch out for. They need to be switched on in wide areas. And when you consider the fact that Middlesbrough do have the, I suppose the permission from Edwards to go long and also the ability to do that, that's probably a little bit of a problem for Norwich and their sort of tactical system, because obviously a lot of what that rotation is based on is the fact that, as we've spoken about in prior episodes of Tactics Board, when the ball is on the Norwich right-hand side, it's the right wing-back that presses. So Jack Stacey often will go and press and push high, whereas Papa Amadou Diallo, as it would be on the left side, will drop in, become the left-back. Jose Cordoba will go across and there will sort of be a shuffle across to a back four. And then if the ball was switched to the other side, Diallo would be the one to press, Stacey would drop. And when you've got a team who can switch the play really, really quickly, can move the ball very quickly and uses the wide areas very often, that's a little bit of a problem. Because if you've got a situation where Diallo has to go from being a deep left back to pressing really high on the left-hand side as a winger, within 1 or 2 seconds as a result of a switch of play, that means Norwich will have to move around a lot, they'll have to cover a lot of ground, and those spaces will likely open up for Middlesbrough. So it might be that maybe they have to be slightly less ambitious with those rotations, or they just have to be really, really good at it. I suppose after a few games of practicing, they will be getting there. But I think that will be an interesting problem for Norwich to deal with. It will be interesting to see whether Manning does go with a bit more of a flat back five, because that does tend to give you a little bit more cover in wide areas. It tends to kind of fill out those wide areas and put more bodies in there to stop overloads. Whereas if you have a back four and you have some of that rotation, particularly if you have somebody like Jose Cordoba sort of filling in as a left back most of the time in a relatively unfamiliar position, that's when the problems could be caused against a team that is really potent out wide. So certainly an area for Manning to address, but I think what goes in Norwich's favour in that sense is the fact that he is adaptive. It's not a situation as it was a lot of the time last season where plan B is to do plan A better, and they wouldn't really have that flexibility or that adaptability to be able to change depending on the opposition. I think Manning will have done plenty of research, and although he affirms every week that it's mainly about what he wants to do and what his team wants to do, we know that a lot of their work will depend on the opposition and sort of what they feel can hurt the opposition and what they feel can mitigate the opposition's strength. So I think there is scope there for maybe more of a flat back five or just completely going with a more traditional back four. I think he'll probably stick with the same system for now, just because of that momentum factor and the fact that the team is still learning that system. But you wouldn't be completely shocked to see a little bit of a change based on how good Middlesbrough have been so far and that strength in wide areas. But certainly there are some other strengths Norwich need to be wary of. Obviously, they're very good from set pieces. They're well drilled, as you would imagine, from a Rob Edwards side. They can go direct. They can be physical. But with Conway up front, they maybe don't have that target man like Colby Bishop was for Portsmouth. So maybe not as much of a threat from sort of crosses from open play or long balls smashed forward and knocked down. But they can counter-attack quickly. They can provide a threat out wide, and there are a few different ways they can hurt Norwich that they'll have to be wary of going into tomorrow's game. Finally then, as promised, we're going to discuss Norwich in an attacking sense, and maybe how they can try to dominate games a little bit further up the pitch, have a bit more possession in those dangerous areas, and try to create chances. Now, for me, one of the main things I look out for when I'm trying to consider how good a team is at creating chances and the way that they do that, especially when it's not, a brutally direct team. Obviously, Norwich do have the ability now to go a little bit longer and maybe mix it up from time to time. But mainly, you'd say they'll create their chances from through balls, from finding Josh Sargent in on goal, from a couple of crosses here and there, and they'll vary things. And I think when you look at those teams, what's quite telling is the link between kind of midfield and attack, and from, a team that's in rested possession in non-dangerous areas, and then can find players in sort of number 10 positions, one pass away from setting up the striker, or at the byline to cut back for the striker, to sort of one pass away from the goal, really. And I think that can be the hardest part in constructing attacks, getting it from that deep midfield position into that number 10 position. And in that situation, you need players who can link things. That's where I think Nunez offered them an awful lot, particularly in that Watford game. You could really tell he was picking up a really intelligent position just between sort of Mirko Topic and Josh Sargent up front, where he could play that final pass. He had so many situations where he was running on, the shot was opening up for him, he had a pass left, a pass right, and he was one action away from creating a really good chance for Norwich. So I think they'll be losing out by losing him. I don't think, to be honest, that either Topic or Jacob Wright has the ability to go and do that. But there are a couple of players who I think can help them in that sense, and one of them is Emiliano Marcondes. Manning has spoken about the fact that him and Josh Sargent have quite a decent relationship. They both have the ability to vary things. Marcondes can run in behind and drop deep, ditto Sargent, and what that means is it's quite an unpredictable situation for opposition defenders. If you had a situation where Marcondes always wanted to drop deep, for example, and Sargent always wanted to run in behind, every time a Norwich midfielder looked up, each defender would know what the man they were marking was going to do, and they would know exactly where they were going. Whereas that ability to interchange and to change the roles, I think, really helps Norwich. And actually, when you can get one of those players in that position, that fulfills that number 10 role. So even if it's Josh Sargent coming in, getting the ball with his back to goal, when you're as good as he is, having the ball with your back to goal 35 yards out is actually one or two steps away from creating a chance for Norwich, really. And although Marcondes probably isn't quite as impressive as Sargent, he can stretch the play for the American forward by running in behind and by testing defenders in that way. When he drops deep, that's probably when he's a little bit more effective on the ball, and when he's in those number 10 positions. I think there were a couple of times he received it really effectively off Papa Amadou Diallo in the two games last week, and then would find passes forward into Josh Sargent or Ante Seaman. So I think Marcondes is really important for that. The ability to interchange with Josh Sargent is really important for that. And then someone who I think really needs to step up for Norwich in that area and picking the ball up in number 10 positions and creating chances and scoring goals is Ante Seaman. Now, we were all, I think, talking about him going into the season as somebody who really could step up, could be a big part of the difference between a 13th place finish and qualifying for the playoffs. He was very good sort of in the friendly games, particularly towards the back end of pre-season, but he just hasn't done it so far, really. Obviously missed the Watford game, and in the two championship games, the first one against Millwall and the second against Portsmouth, there have been some decent signs, but he's just not really been that involved. He's not produced that quality on a regular basis. And the first thing to say is probably that it's literally been two games. Let's not jump the gun and say that, the season's not going to be as good for Ante Seaman as we all thought it would be. I think the talent is still there, and he's certainly still in a good position. But now's the time when maybe Norwich want to control games a bit more in an attacking sense. They want to create chances. They want to find players in those number 10 positions a little bit more easily, that you want him to really grasp hold of games and find a little bit of confidence and get on the ball and really try things. Because I think when we've seen him do that, even last season as he was learning about the Championship and getting to grips with the Championship, I think we could see that once he got in that mood, he was really, really effective for Norwich. So I think he's somebody who maybe needs to grasp hold of things a little bit more, needs to be a little bit better at finding the right spaces at the right time so that he can get the ball with a couple of seconds to decide what he's going to do and to exploit that space. Because I think when he does that, we've seen, his shooting from distance, the quality of his passing at times, his first touch. I think as soon as he gets in those positions, he will cause trouble and he can be that link between midfield and attack for Norwich. But we just haven't seen enough of it yet. So it'll be interesting to see whether he can do that on Saturday. There's certainly going to be a lot of tactical themes that will be worth tracking in the game against Middlesbrough. And of course, we'll have all of that covered across our channels. So go to pinkham.com/subscribe if you haven't already. We've currently got an offer on £6 for 6 months, which I think is excellent value. But don't take my word for it. Go over to pinkham.com to see what all of our coverage is about and subscribe if you fancy it and you haven't already. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. Of course, we'll be back very soon for the next one, and hopefully it will be similarly positive in vibe as today, after hopefully another win against Middlesbrough tomorrow. See you later.